We had time, we could also look at Psalms 32 and 51, good examples of Psalms of disorientation where the psalmist is saying, I know why I'm here. I mean, that Psalm 51 is probably the greatest example of David's psalm after the sin with Bathsheba. What is this? It's that Iron Man thing I have in my chest. We gonna go with this? All right. Let's just carry on. Okay, yeah, and like I said, Psalm 51. David knows why he is where he is. But tonight, and for tonight and next week, we'll look at the Psalms that show us that we can come out of that pit. And bigger picture, what we see is it's God who pulls us out. That God is there to give us a way out, to provide us an escape from this place that is a The first one in particular goes through the whole process of it. You go, the psalmist will go from, in one psalm, from orientation, disorientation to new orientation. So, what we'll see is, as we saw in some of those psalms of disorientation, where we had that, what I call the deep breath moment, where the psalmist says everything's terrible, everything's awful, but they kind of go, but I trust in you. These Psalms we'll look at tonight and next week are the Psalms that's the whole picture, is that if I'm to get out of that, I know it's God, and where do I end up? Tonight we're going to look at Psalms that center around being thankful that God pulled us out of that. We'll look at two of those, and then one that is the confidence that we can have in God, that is kind of, you can kind of put it in the category of a praise psalm, but it really fits this reorientation. And we'll look at that in some more detail. I asked Mike Powell if he would lead us in a word of prayer, and then we will proceed from there. Amen. Thanks, Mike. Have you ever been in a time where you're in kind of a spiritual funk, or something goes wrong in your life, and you hit that kind of that low point? Well, Zach said, when are we not? Hopefully we're not always in that, because we shouldn't always be in that. But when we come out of that, I mean, have you ever had an experience where you can kind of look back on it and go, wow, I was really, I don't know, fill in the blank, immature, not quite as mature as I should have been spiritually, went through this rough thing, and now I'm better. I mean, that's what these Psalms are about. These, Okay, let's go with this one. Number one, you got to go with the starter. Okay, Psalm 30, an example of the whole process. It goes from things are good, things are terrible, to the coming out of it. Verse 1, this has this idea of everything's good with God. I'll extol you, O Lord, for you have driven me up and have not let my foes rejoice over me. Sounds like there's a good feeling there. There's a good attitude there. And in the beginning of this psalm, things do seem to be settled. Things seem to be going okay for the psalmist. But then as we go through, he recounts how this all fell apart. I mean, even in his psalm, he about how things fall apart and how God brings him out on the other side. Look at the first 3 verses. Again, this is a psalm of David. I'll extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up and not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol. You restored me to life from among those who go down to the pit. Does anybody's translation say something else besides Sheol? From the grave. This is a place of just sorrow. This is a place of things are not good here. And you can see that pit, Sheol, almost death imagery in the words that he uses. You brought me back from Sheol. You brought me back from the pit, from the depths. He wants David, it's David, by the way. David wants his audience, his readers to know, I went from this point to I was in a bad place. Things were not going well. He wants to see that he got to that point of despair, that disorientation, that he got there before God drew him out of that. Look at verses 4 and 5. He says, sing praises to the Lord, O you his saints, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. So what we see different in this is that he just spends just a verse or two to say, I was happy that God was with me, didn't let my enemies rejoice over me, but then it went, and then I was at the depths. But then he spends the rest of the time saying, I called out to God for help, and that was the only place I was going to get help. And he begins to share why things are better and his perspective of how things are better. When he says this expression, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning, what's he trying to say? How would you say that? Short period of time? What's that? This too will pass. He makes this call out to the people. He wants the people to join him in this praise. He's saying this works for all of us. That, yeah, things get bad. Things get bad in all of our lives. But he says, look at the way he says from verse 2, cried to you for help, you healed me, brought my soul up from Sheol. Verse 3, restored my life to me, those who go down to the pit. And then verse 4, he's immediately saying, sing praises to him. So he's saying that we're going to get in those spots. We're going to find ourselves in those lucky places. But God's the one who's going to get us out. And that's what he's saying. This is just a blip on the radar of life. These are short times. Do they ever feel like short times? No, they just don't. But that's the great thing about these Psalms, is to remind us that, like Nathan used the expression, this too shall pass. Have you ever been in a bad spot and those are the words of comfort somebody tried to give you? This won't last forever. And you want to go, oh, shut up, it's happening today. That's how we feel. I think of a time with one of my children that something bad had happened. And I was trying to say, eventually you'll look back at this and things will be okay. Poor parenting move right there. It's just like, oh, it's not what I want to hear right now. But we need to know that. And it's hard for us to process that, and it's hard for us to think that way. But David here, a guy who's seen his share of bad times, reminds us, yeah, things will be bad, but things will get better. And maybe that's why we have some of these Psalms, because you don't want It's not that easy to hear this from a friend because you want to just hit them in the mouth when they say this stuff to you. But you read it and go, yeah, that's right. In the, at night I'm going to be weeping, but I know it's going to change. It'll be better. Nolan. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when Nolan says that David seems to have maybe a firsthand account of the fact that God does get angry and God does get upset, but he doesn't stay that way. So that's the picture that we see in this, is that this bad thing may happen. Maybe it's our fault. Maybe it's our sin that gets us in this. But if we reach out to God and say, God, get me out of this, there's going to be a better morning, if you will. Okay, so look at 6 through 10. He begins to kind of describe this whole situation. It says, as for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you made my mountain stand strong. You hid your face. I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cry, and to the Lord I plead for mercy. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me. O Lord, be my helper. Now this sounds like some of those lament psalms. Remember in those lament psalms, there was several examples of those where the psalmist would say, God, please save me from this terrible thing, because after all, I can't praise you if I'm dead. And that's the same thing he's saying here. What profit is there in my death? Is dust going to praise you? And where's your praise going to come from? We looked at Asaph's, where he said that. He goes, I'm the one that I lead the nation in worship. If you let this terrible thing happen to me, may have been leprosy, may have been something else. But he says, you let this terrible thing happen to me, who's going to lead the people in praise? So there's that kind of, the term was a motivation. It's a motivation for God almost. And David kind of uses the same approach here to say, when I was in this place, this was my thinking. And it seems a little weird here because the thanksgiving has already happened, and then he kind of backpedals and goes into this kind of lament section. But we do that, don't we? When things are bad and you get out of it, I guess speak for myself, you get out of it and you kind of go, man, I was in a bad spot. I was thinking this and I was thinking this and I was saying all this stuff about God and negotiating with God, but things are better now. And that's kind of what David's doing here. He's saying, this is where I was when all this bad stuff was happening. And I was in this negotiations, if you will, with God. And he calls out to God and he says, here's what's going to happen if you allow this bad thing to continue with me. The whole idea that, even if you allow me to die, where's the praise going to come from? When we lose a loved one, how do we deal with it? As far as, I don't want to use that word. How do we, what's a way to process that? When you lose a family member, you just write them off and forget about them? Nathan. Yeah, there's a process. There's a grief cycle is what some people call it. But what do you do to kind of help with that? Talk about them. When we do memorial services here, there's always, the family puts together usually a PowerPoint of just a gob of pictures. For some reason, I always think of Dennis Gully's service. And all of Dennis's pictures, the guy did everything. There's he was in World War II and he ran a small country. He did everything. And I remember as the slides were going through, I knew he was a huge San Diego Chargers fan. And I was like, there's a point, if I'd have seen him on the sideline wearing a headset coaching the Chargers, I would have went, I guess, figures. Because that's what we do. We go back through people's lives and we just talk about them. Sitting at the hospital a couple, 3 weeks ago with Eveline Mitchell. She's just talking about her and JJ. And nobody was prodding her going, now let's talk. Let's tell us. That's just what we do. We reflect back on where we've been. We reflect back on our past. That's kind of what David seems to be doing here. That he was in a bad place, and God got him through it. So he's kind of reminiscing, doesn't seem like the right word, but that's kind of what it is. He's kind of reflecting back on where he was in this moment. And kind of, in that way, it allows him and it allows us as the readers to fully appreciate what God has done for him, doesn't it? I mean, when you read him saying, I was in the depths, I was in the pit, I was in Sheol, and I was at the point where I'm like, God, listen, if I die, who's going to praise you? And now, but before that, he's already told us, God got me out of this. And he'll recount that too. But it's just that idea of reflecting on where we've been. Look at verses 11 and 12. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, that my glory may sing your praises and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. Now he's got to the end. And like I said, you see the whole cycle. He starts out, things are good, and then he goes, but then I got to a point where I was down in that pit. I thought I was going to die, whatever it was. I was at the lowest of lows, and I called out to God. And yes, and then he kind of stops in those middle verses and goes, I was in this negotiation with God. I was in this bad place with God. But then as he wraps up, he says that God has turned for me my mourning into dancing. My sackcloth has clothed me with goodness. When you think of somebody clothed with sackcloth in mourning, who do you think of? Job. And when you think of that image of Job in that pit in the sackcloth and ashes, and he's scraping the boils, Job could have said this. It would have been a little while. We don't know how long. It would have been a while longer maybe. We don't know. And could you imagine what all Job could have put in there? I mean, things went really, really bad, and you did this for me, and you blessed me tenfold, and you blessed me in this way. So, I mean, Job's the living example of a psalm of new orientation, because he goes from wealthy and prosperous and family to the pit. And then at the end of it, God pulls him out of it and blesses him even more. And that's really the picture you get from Psalm 30 with David, is that, the information, at least in the ESV, that we have on this psalm is that it's a psalm in the temple, or a song at the dedication of the temple. So we don't know a whole lot of detail what David is actually talking about here, but we know it's at a point where he has a lot to reflect on that has gone on in his life. So what we see with this psalm is the transformation that can take place when we allow God to do it. Whatever our individual pit of Sheol, our pit of despair might be, like I said, we may get us there ourselves. It may be an illness. It may be circumstances that happen to our family. These psalms, this psalm in particular, reminds us that's kind of a cycle. But as long as we turn to God, again, you go back to verse 4. Sing praises to the Lord, O you his saints. Give thanks to his holy name, for his anger is but for a moment. And really, I mean, in this situation, it does seem like this is a reflection of David, that his pit was brought on by himself, because he talks about God's anger. He understands that, things happened to him that God said, you shouldn't have done this, so here's what's going to happen. But we can put ourselves in the same situation, change the wording a little bit. Maybe it's not God's anger, maybe it's this situation. It's but for a moment, as long as I'm singing praises to God and I'm reaching out to God to bring me out of it. Now, that doesn't make it easy. I mean, that's what, where's I have here? That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be difficult times. It just means that we have to remember that God's there for us. And these psalms remind us that God can be there to pull us out of that. God can help us in our own personal times of transformation. Think of this psalm in an evangelistic way for just a second. If you were to sit down with somebody who doesn't know God, doesn't know the Bible, you want to tell them about Jesus, you want to tell them about who God is, how could you use this psalm to tell somebody about God's nature? John. Yeah. What John said, that you relate that to life in sin, you're at the lowest point that you can be spiritually. But if you reach out to God, there's that moving forward that can happen, that God is part of that. Steve? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's a reminder that God's always faithful. That's what Steve said, that God's always faithful. It's us. We're the ones that move from God. I mean, like I said, with what John said, what Steve said, both. You sit down with somebody who doesn't know God, and it takes 2 minutes to set the background here. There's written by a king who did a lot of bad things and had a lot of sin that he had to deal with. And look what he says. That, yeah, we can be at a point where things feel really, really bad and very distant from God. But look how he ends. When he restores that relationship with God to what it should be, you've loosed my sackcloth, you've clothed me with gladness. My glory may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. That's a whole different attitude, isn't it? I mean, that's a whole different approach to life. George?
I'm just thinking, thank God like David did. But it seemed
Yeah. So George said, knowing God like David did. I mean, David had a different relationship with God. I mean, yeah, that expression that about God's anger, David would understand that. Anybody else?
If you can tell, we're all kind of boastful. I got this life. Usually that's right before the top of the
Oh, yeah.
can do it on your own. God loves them.
Yeah.
You only look on the
Yeah, what April's saying, you can kind of look at this from the idea of pride and humility, that, even in this psalm, David starts out in a high place, and then it doesn't take 2 verses to where he gets to the low point where he was humbled. And I believe David's a great example of just that, of humility. Don't get too big for your britches. I mean, that's really kind of the story of so many of the kings of Judah, Israel both, that get a little cocky and God humbles them, and some of them turn around, some of them don't.
the modern, the services, services, care of other people, allow them to do different things because they want to go up. And then with working out, we're in a lot of pain, place transformation.
Oh, yeah.
It is right.
Sure.
Go on.
Yeah, she's making the comparison to like military service. You go into the military, you go into boot camp, and it's not for you to get acclimated. It's for you to get squashed to the point of being reformed. And it's the same way we do physically with our bodies. I mean, some people do physically with their bodies. You go to work out, and you go to the point where I can't do this anymore. I can't do 1. I can't do 3. I can't do 5 more. And you push it because you're looking to make a transformation. And that's kind of the essence of what happens with this in this psalm, that David goes to a low point, sees God out there, and God helps him up, and things get better. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, what Richard's saying, and I think that's exactly right, especially contextually. I think David is talking about discipline. And like I said, you can make the comparison to Hebrews, what is that, 4? 12. Hebrews 12, where it talks about discipline. Nobody likes discipline. It's not fun when it happens, but it happens because God has to do that for us. And I believe, like I said, with David, because of his history and the fact that he says God's anger, I believe he's talking about discipline. Sometimes with us, it's not necessarily God's discipline. It's something that happens. But in this case, I do believe it's discipline. And it's that whole idea that that's what makes us better. Our discipline from God, I think, functions a little differently. Like I said, a lot of that is we bring it on ourselves, and it's consequences that we have to then deal with, which is, in essence, discipline. And it makes us better in the long run. Okay, turn over to Psalm 40. Same idea here with this, things are bad and I'm coming out of it, this idea of deliverance. Psalm 40 is too long for us to read all the way through, which is different with some of these Psalms. But there's an obvious two-part, there's obviously two parts of this, and you'll be able to see the distinction. Verses 1 through 10 do talk about God's deliverance. It talks about the fact that God is the one who's going to bring him out of this. Again, David writing here. And then verses 11 through 17 is back in that kind of that whole idea of the reflection of while he was in that bad place. Look at verse 1, though. It's up there on the screen, but look at it in your Bible. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. Keep going into 2. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. You see, these two are very similar. They don't spend a whole lot of time on how they got to the point, but it just starts out was, here's where I am, but it was God who got me out. Look at some of the words that are used here in verse 1. I waited, and here's what God did. He inclined to me. He heard me. He drew me up. He set my feet upon a rock. What is he saying? Saying that God acted, that God moved in his life. I don't know why, for some reason, but to me, for some reason, I just thought that was really cool, that he starts out immediately saying, I was in a bad place, and I reached out to God. I waited patiently for the Lord. We don't do that very well. I don't do that very well. If I'm in a bad spot, I want it fixed. Even if I did it, I still want God to fix it. But what David is saying is that I knew it was going to be God who was going to help me out of this. So I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me, and he heard my cry. And then, like I said, he just says that he lifted me. He set my feet. He gave me a new place. He gave me a firm place. He gave me a new song. He's using this language to remind his readers, maybe to remind himself, but to remind his readers, and I believe us centuries later, that God was neither absent nor inattentive in David's bad place, whatever this one was. Don't we need to be reminded of that sometimes? I mean, like I said, even if it's our own sin that puts us in a low place, but if it's other stuff, circumstances, it's so easy to feel like, God, where are you? Why did you let this happen? Where were you? I prayed and I prayed and I prayed, and you didn't listen. I don't even know if you were there. But David said, I waited patiently for the Lord. And then he acted. He did all these things. It was him who got me on solid footing again. George. Oh, yeah. Yeah, George said that he seems like he's at this point where he feels really good because God's forgiven him. I think that's exactly it, that he was in a place of despair over whatever it may have been, and God pulls him out of it. And now he reflects back on that and says, God got me out of it. He put me there. He made things better. Verses 4 and 5, let me just read these two, and it kind of transitions here a little bit. He said, as for me, I sit... Nope, it doesn't say that. It does in chapter 41, but not there. Verse 4 of 40, blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts toward us. None can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they are more than can be told. Does that seem to fit right there? I mean, when I was reading through there was two other ones that I had to try and decide which ones to use. All of these are a little bit schizophrenic to me, it seems like. Because they go, I was in this bad place, and I cried out to the Lord, and the Lord's great, and then it was terrible, and I remember how bad it was, but God was so good to me. And when you read, because that's kind of what this does here. Because he says that I waited patiently, the Lord heard me, I was in this bad place, he lifted me up, he put a new song on my mouth, gave me a song of praise. Blessed is the man who trusts God. And then again, he goes back to where he was in the bad spot. But again, that's how we are. I mean, these are so reflective of human character. I mean, we find ourselves in a bad place spiritually. And when we turn that over to God, I mean, you all know I spend a week every summer at camp with teenagers. I don't know that we've ever had a year that there hasn't been a kid who early in the week decides, I'm changing my life, sits around the campfire crying, telling everybody how terrible his life's been, and says, I'm fixing it right now, and that's all they want to talk about for the rest of the week. Man, I don't. It's going to be hard going home because there's this and this, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And as I've been doing these psalms, I've been thinking, these are the psalms I need to give to those kids. It's not going to be rosy all the time. You're going to have points where you go and you plummet. But look at these and go, God can get me back out of that too. It doesn't mean I'm always staying on a high. That's not, I mean, it's like what Zach said, sometimes you feel like you're always in the low spot. That's not okay. It's not realistic to think you're going to always be in a high spot either. And these psalms show us that you can kind of plunge into that thing of despair or confusion or whatever it is, but God can get you out of it too. Verses 6 through 8, we see an expression or a phrase or terminology at least that we see repeated quite often in the Old Testament. In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. When we read those phrases, when we read that idea that God doesn't want offerings, God doesn't want burnt offerings and sacrifices, what does that really tell us? What does God want? He wants us. God, He wants open ears. He wants open hearts. These expressions of, burnt offerings I did not desire. What I wanted is mercy, justice, and faith. That's a butchering of Micah, whatever it is. But we see that over and over. David seems to say it here like he's learned it. I mean, it almost seems like he's acknowledging something that they should all understand. Because it's not like he's speaking for God. He's just saying, in sacrifice and offering, you have not delighted, but you've given me an open ear. He's saying, I get it. I know that. It isn't about going through the process of all the offerings and sacrifices. Not to say that God doesn't want their worship to be done properly. But properly means their mindset's going to be right. Their hearts are going to be right. And David seems to just kind of be acknowledging that. He seems to be kind of just saying, yes, God, you're right about that. And that's maybe where he wasn't. And then he goes on to talk about God's law in, still down through into verse 8, talks about God's statutes and how much he loves God's writing. And we talked about Psalm 119. And it's not really attributed to David, but there's a lot of reason to think it really might be David. This seems to be one, this psalm is attributed to David. But it's some of the same idea that we see in verse 8. I delight to do your will, O God. Your law is within my heart. That sounds very much like something you could pull out of Psalm 119. He seems to be captivated by doing God's law, by knowing God's law. And that's interesting in this whole idea of coming out of that pit. Because, he's talked about the bad place he was in. But then as he's talking about coming out of it, he talks about worship and God's law. We live in a religious culture that says if you're in a bad place spiritually, you should, go off somewhere and find yourself out in the woods or whatever. David seems to think I should be in a place of worship and I should be in a place where I'm in God's Word. Dan, do you have your hand up, or is that an impulse? Yeah, I saw. I wasn't going to go into that, but I'll tell you, that is there. That's not the best translation of that term. Because it is the idea of you've given me open ears, you have, I understand that you're the boss would be a way to say that. Because then he goes into the thing about God's law. But the idea of piercing really isn't in the language there. But the concept is of knowing that God's in charge. We'll meet again at 8:05 and continue, as I was supposed to get further than this. 9 and 10, the psalmist David here will also say that that he's going to be, he wants to show people God's goodness. So as he reflects on where he was and begins to come out of his pit, what he'll say is that your works, I'm not going to hide under a basket. I'm not going to hide them from the world around me. That I want people to know about this. And I guess that's a good thing for us to end with. That thinking evangelistically, yes, but thinking just about dealing with people, dealing with your kids, dealing with your families. Let people know. Yeah, I've had rough spiritual times, and God's got me through it. Because, that's one thing that I've shared with my kids as they've gotten older. That, yes, as much as they thought so until they were like 9 or 10 or 12, Daddy's not perfect. And it helps them as 18 and 21-year-olds now to know that there's a problem, that there might be problems that they have to deal with. I've done it. I've dealt with them, and God got me through them. So any thoughts very, very quickly? There's teenagers piling up at the door, giving me dirty looks.
The number verse that God put his feet against like the rock, which is God, the foundation, and made footsteps firm. So God doesn't want to sit around, like I'm gonna pray and just sit in my room.
Yeah.
Like a consistent prayer and patience prayer, but also moving and having years.
Yeah, that's the whole idea of God draws you to a more solid foundation. All right, we'll pick up right there next week and